Today we're privileged to have Ted Sadler, who actually spoke in the very first series of Blackheath Philosophy Forums way back in the dim mists of time in 2002. So remote is it in time that I can't for the life of me remember what it was that he spoke about, but it was very interesting, I think. And a year before last he also gave us an excellent talk on the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. And German philosophy is something that Ted has made something of a specialty of. He's written a couple of books on it and actually translated 3 volumes of the collected works of Martin Heidegger, which is, he's the very popular philosopher, very fashionable in academia nowadays, but instead in the fact he's now known to have been a believing, committed, absolutely sincere Nazi. So this is one of the peculiarities of modern academia, that people like that come to be seen as quite significant. So I'll just let Ted get straight into it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Peter, and I'd like to thank Peter and the committee of the Blackheath Philosophy Forum for again inviting me to contribute to this series this year on civilization. Now I have got a text prepared for today's talk, which I was going to simply read out, but when I read through the text yesterday, I thought I'd be better off just talking more informally. The text will go onto the website of the Blackheath Philosophy Forum this week, and I have got a couple of copies with me today, although I'd like to give those out only to people who urgently want to read it, because it will be coming onto the site of the Blackheath Forum within a few days. Now, the title of the talk is Suicide of the West, and this is taken from the title of a 1964 book by an American political writer called James Burnham, who in his earlier years was a Trotskyist, and indeed personally acquainted with Leon Trotsky, but who then became a conservative and published a number of very controversial books, of which this is the most famous, Suicide of the West, 1964, subtitled The Pathology of Liberalism. However, I'm not intending to talk in any detail about Burnham's book, but just to use the idea of the suicide of the West and the idea of liberalism as a pathology and as the main contributing cause of the decline of the West, to guide my comments today on the general theme of the decline and indeed the self-destruction of the West that faces us today. I'd like to begin, however, with some general comments about the meaning of the word West and the meaning of Western civilization, because these are very general and possibly vague concepts that are used often in a very confusing way. Sometimes it seems that people use the expression Western civilization to mean the civilization which began more or less in the 18th century in Europe, the civilization which began in the century of the Enlightenment and perhaps follows on from the French Revolution. The concept of the West, of course, even more recently, is associated with the conflict between the West and the so-called communist bloc. And in 1964, when James Burnham was writing, he had this in mind as well. People refer to the West as more or less the free world, so-called. The communist bloc sometimes was even referred to as the East, because it incorporated Eastern Europe, the communist countries of Eastern Europe, and of course the Soviet Union. But the concept of Western civilization is of course much broader than that, and it, if we think about its most fundamental meaning, I think we have to go back to the origins of the civilization which grew up in Europe in the first few centuries AD, the centuries of the growth of the Roman Empire, and the centuries which led into the medieval period of civilization. Western civilization, it is well known, well, it's often said, began back in the days of ancient Greece. The origin of Western civilization in ancient Greece is a commonplace observation. And we know, of course, that the civilization which began in ancient Greece spread in a certain way through the whole of the East following the conquest of Alexander the Great, and then influenced the emerging Christian religion through the fact that Greek was the language in which the New Testament was written and became the language of the eastern part of the Roman Empire in the early centuries AD. Then this was the basis as well for the Western branch of this civilization, which took off, of course, following the Roman Empire based in Italy, and spread to the western, what we now call the western part of Europe. Some historians consider that Charlemagne, who died in 814, is the founder of Western civilization. And that would be a fair enough statement if we mean by Western civilization Western European. But at the time of Charlemagne, around 800, there was also, of course, the eastern part of Christianity, often referred to as the Byzantine civilization. However, they did merge, they did actually form one single unitary civilization in the broadest sense, which was known as, and we can legitimately call, the civilization of Christendom. And this civilization, you could say, lasted from the time that the Roman Emperor Constantine, in about 315 AD, converted to Christianity and decreed tolerance towards the Christian religion, gradually, over the course of the century, that tolerance towards the Christian religion became a policy of favouring or even legislating that the Christian religion was the only religion permissible within the Roman Empire. So it was during that period that the so-called religion of Christendom grew up, and despite all the vicissitudes of history, the various devastating invasions from the Vikings and from the Eastern peoples, which affected Christendom, nevertheless, the civilization of Christendom, we could say, survived as a unit, as a self-conscious unit, where people from its both eastern and western branches would say, yes, we belong to the one civilization, notwithstanding our differences. That lasted through until, well, that's a question as to when it lasted. Certainly it lasted up until the 16th and possibly the 17th centuries. The civilization of Christendom was besieged in the form of the Turkish attack on the city of Vienna in 1683, when it was felt throughout Europe that the entire civilization of Christendom might fall if Vienna had fallen at that time. But it didn't fall because of the combined defence operations of the so-called Holy Roman Empire at the time, in combination with the Polish and Lithuanian Commonwealth. However, it is just as clear that we live today in a civilization which is not Christendom. Nobody could think that our civilization now in the West is Christendom. For how long it has not been Christendom is, I suppose, well, it must be a matter of controversy or pedantry, perhaps. But one could say for at least 100 years, possibly for 200 or 300 or 400 years, the civilization in the West has no longer been the civilization of Christendom, but it is a common observation that Christianity is weakening or fading as a cultural force every decade, and is now weaker in the West in general, particularly among the intellectual elites, the political leaders, the intellectual leaders, than it has ever been before, but certainly sufficient for us to say, certainly we are now living in a period which is post-Christendom. Now, before I continue about what that means, what it is to be post-Christendom, I'd like to make a few observations on the concept of civilization. I think it's clear that the very concept of civilization and discussions around this concept are a lot more popular, a lot more frequent on the conservative side than they are on the radical or leftist side of the political spectrum. There is, and has been for many years, possibly centuries, a certain suspicion on the part of many leftist philosophers and thinkers of the very concept of civilization. And the reason for that is clear, that civilization seems to imply a hierarchy, an aristocracy, inequality, and superiority. So one may think of a civilised society being superior to an uncivilised society, which is something that many people take exception to. There is, of course, both a descriptive concept of civilisation and a normative concept. The descriptive concept of civilisation would seem to be that, well, any society which is sufficiently complex, urbanised, possesses literacy, a division of labour, cities, can be called a civilisation, whereas a society which is tribal, say maybe nomadic, purely pastoral, agricultural, small scale, non-urbanised, is not normally called a civilisation, although that is a merely descriptive difference, although you find that some people object even to that differentiation. On the other hand, there is, as I said a moment ago, the suggestion that civilisation is something superior to non-civilisation. Well, we know there have been many forms of many types of civilisation. And the Aztecs of Mexico had a civilisation where they, based on the widespread employment of slaves, not only that, however, but of human sacrifice. I think it's thought that no society has ever sacrificed human beings on such a massive scale as the Aztecs, that used to rip out the living, beating heart of their sacrificial victims on a very regular scale, en masse. Is that a civilisation? Would the Aztecs perhaps be denied the honorific title of civilisation because of that? Or should we simply say, well, the Aztecs were a civilisation because they absolutely did build great monuments, they were highly urbanised, there was a high degree of complexity in their society and so forth. However, I mention these issues really only to pass on, but to indicate some of the controversies in the background in relation to civilisation. I said I will mention one more thing, particularly in regard to Marxist or neo-Marxist reactions to the concept of civilisation. The Marxist point of view of the Marxist philosophy of history has it that all history is the history of class struggle, and meaning that beyond what Marx himself meant, and Friedrich in the classic book expounding this point of view, which is called The Origin of Family, Private Property and the State, a kind of Bible of Marxism, that there was a society prior to all class struggle, back in the dark, dim periods of early human history, of prehistoric times, of hunter-gatherer societies, that, however, as soon as society became complex and developed cities, agriculture and so forth, what happened was the development of classes, and this always meant hierarchy, and it always meant the oppression of one class over another. Now, from this Marxist point of view, therefore, there is no real unity to any cultures after that very early period of civilization, very early period of society, the early prehistoric period. because every society is characterised by this fundamental division between the classes. There is an oppressor and oppressed. Again, only in the future, according to classic Marxist doctrine, will this change. After the revolution, things will change to resemble the situation that existed prior to the original development of complex societies and hierarchies and classes. So that's another reason why some people are sceptical about the concept of civilization. I believe, however, it can be said about civilization that the fundamental thing which characterises it is a unity. A civilization is based on a unity. There must be a unity in consciousness, and that must be something one could call a civilizational consciousness, a common sense of identity and participation in the same civilization. People think of themselves as members of the one unified civilization, and that applies whether they are king or whether they are a common worker. And I believe that this is historically true when one looks, as far as one has any evidence of even ancient Egypt, that the ancient Egyptians, common workers who built the pyramids, they were not slaves. They were proud to build the pyramids. They identified themselves with the king, even though they were commoners. I believe that this is the case throughout history, in all the civilizations of which we are aware or have any knowledge at all. Now, I'm perfectly aware that the Marxists may challenge that position. Okay. Now, that is by way of certain background qualifications. Now comes the basic thesis that I want to present in this talk, which is coming off the title of that book by James Burnham. The thesis is that this civilization, if we call it that we currently live in, is declining and is being destroyed, that the agent of this destruction is what James Burnham says it is, namely liberalism, and that this amounts to suicide, civilizational or cultural suicide, because of the simple fact that liberalism is a product of the West. The West is declining, is, according to James Burnham, very probably doomed, not because of some external force. We might think in these days some people speak about Islam as if Islam is a threat to Western civilization. I don't believe that Islam is a threat to Western civilization. I believe that if Western civilization is in decline, it's because of internal weaknesses, which may indeed be capitalised on by Islam. But Islam is not a fundamental threat to the West. If the West is under threat, it's under threat because of itself, and I would like to endorse thus James Burnham's thesis. It's liberalism which has done this and continues to do it. But what is liberalism then? Liberalism is a very loose and slippery term. It is maddeningly difficult to define it and discuss it. But I would like to say that I do not mean by liberalism merely what could be called civil liberties liberalism, that is a particular political philosophy or political policy which tolerates free speech, free assembly, and things of that sort. That is one meaning of the word liberalism, but it is, to my mind, a secondary meaning. It has indeed some links to the more fundamental meaning of liberalism, which I will go on to explain. So that's to make that perfectly clear. I am an opponent of liberalism, like James Burnham. I think liberalism is possibly the most pernicious cultural and philosophical tendency that has ever appeared in human history. But that does not mean that I'm against political liberalism in the sense that I just explained. I believe that the pernicious liberalism is something else. That's what I will now mention. So what is this liberalism? This philosophy of liberalism, this underlying belief system of liberalism that is destroying the West. To understand this, I believe it is good to recall the thoughts of Friedrich Nietzsche, who, in looking at the fate of the West with an incisiveness that few others have brought to bear, spoke about the death of God. The death of God, according to Nietzsche, was the thing that decides everything in the history of the West. There comes a point, according to Nietzsche, when this death of God sets in. Now, it's not an overnight death. And what really Nietzsche means by the death of God is the death of belief in God, the death of a vital belief in God, which is such that it can determine culture and give life to culture and keep culture creative and dynamic. Now, Nietzsche maintained in the 1880s famously that God was dead, but he added, this means catastrophe for the West. This means a cataclysm for the West. I know that Nietzsche is, of course, very popular among many people who come under the heading of what I would call liberalism. And many people think that the death of God does not mean a cataclysm for the West, but they believe that it means hope for the West. They believe that the West can get on very well without God, that the death of God is therefore something positive for them. It is the removal of the church control of society. It is the removal of dogmatism. It is the removal of authority. It is the removal of superstition and ignorance, so they say. And so the death of God for them can be only something to be welcomed. And this is indeed what we hear from some of the most influential philosophers of the present day, such as Alain Badiou, but also the earlier French postmodernist philosophers such as Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze, and others, with whom you will no doubt undoubtedly be familiar, at least with their names. Nietzsche did not think that. He did not think that the West was going to move into a period of enlightenment with the death of God. He believed that the West was going to move into a period of utter darkness with the death of God. A period of cataclysm. Because he thought The death of God is the removal of the foundations of the moral system and the meaning system of Western civilization. With that removed, the West will collapse. And Nietzsche thought that the only way around this was to turn to a new God, a new religion. And this was what he offered himself. The death of God for him was not something which would lead into a period of pluralism, democracy, secularism, and anti-authoritarianism. It would lead into a period of catastrophe which could only be averted by turning to a new God, his God. And you know, of course, the symbols around which his idea of God is known: the Superman, the will to power, the eternal return. These are the motifs, the formulas that Nietzsche refers to in respect of his new God. But I can't go into that, there's not time. But just to say that for Nietzsche, it was a foreboding of catastrophe, this death of God. But this foreboding of catastrophe was something which attaches to liberalism. What liberalism meant for Nietzsche was this catastrophe, this lack of foundations, this dying of the foundations and fading away of the foundations of morality and meaning, which could only be remedied in the way, as I said before, by turning towards a new God. However, there is one other detail that needs to be mentioned here. And you find it in the beginning of Nietzsche's most famous book, Thus Spake Zarathustra, in the prologue of that work, where he has Zarathustra, his great prophet, who appears and speaks to the men of the marketplace, as he says, speaks to them, telling them about the death of God. But these people are already atheists, and they laugh at him. And they say, well, we know that God is dead, and we're very pleased with that, because we're very happy, because we have now a very well-organised life. We have invented happiness, is the way Nietzsche puts it in the mouth of these people who he calls the last men. The last men. So the last men who inherit the world after the death of God, as Nietzsche sees it. These are people who have lost any sense of God and who see the purpose of life in purely hedonistic terms. Happiness, pleasure, and so forth. He says, a pleasant death. Medicine for a pleasant death. Poison for a pleasant death. Long life, healthy life. Pleasure and a pleasant death. This is what the last men want. And that's one outcome of the death of God, or the death of, or the reign of liberalism, as Nietzsche understands it. Now, let me just say something more about this belief system of liberalism. And I said before, it's a very difficult belief system to specify. Because what is the content of this belief system? What does it believe in? What does a liberal believe in? It's not too hard to say what a Christian believes in, or what a Muslim believes in, or what a Hindu believes in, or what a Platonist believes in, or what a Taoist believes in. Not too hard. But what does a liberal believe in? Now, the cliche The formula, the slogan, of course, freedom. Freedom. The Liberal believes in freedom. And of course we know that that has been a slogan, including in politics, and probably more in politics than anywhere else. Freedom, what sort of freedom? Freedom to choose. Freedom from authority. Freedom from compulsion. Freedom from being told what to do. Freedom from models of morality and of meaning that we are supposed to adopt, that are, as it were, forced upon us. That's what it means. If anybody thinks it means something else as well as that, well, perhaps we can speak about that in the discussion period. But that is what liberalism means positively. If you take that to be something positive, what it really points to, however, is that liberalism has a fundamentally negative significance. It says there is no absolute truth. There is no absolute authority. There is no absolute morality. There is no dogma. It says this, and it maintains this position with vehemence, except there is a little problem, which is a logical problem. Liberalism says there is no absolute truth. By Nietzsche, by the way, the death of God was synonymous with the death of truth, with a capital T. God is truth. The death of God is the death of truth, death of absolute truth. Now, the liberal says there's no such thing as absolute truth. Now, if we ask the liberal, well, you say there's no such thing as absolute truth. Is that statement an absolute truth? Is that absolutely true, what you just say? Or are you saying that there is no absolute truth except for the statement that there is no absolute truth? And how can that be justified? Well, that's by way of the logical problem of liberalism. But corresponding to that fundamental, what I take to be a fundamental contradiction in liberalism, is the fundamental negativity of liberalism as a whole. Always concerned to refute authority, to resist authority, to engage in rebellion against authority in a myriad of ways, without, however, having any positive thing to put, no positive value to put in the place of the authorities, and of course it's every possible type of authority that liberalism has criticised. Now, very quickly, just to mention the opponents of liberalism, I think it's really one of the most extraordinary things in the history of culture that over the last, especially the last 100 years, a mentality has developed in the West which takes liberalism to be obvious, to be absolutely natural, self-evident, obvious, and the only possible belief system that anybody could reasonably have. It often escapes the liberal, or at least they don't want to think about it, even though the liberal will typically say that they, the liberals, are the most tolerant and open-minded people that have ever lived, but it often doesn't seem to occur to the liberals that almost everybody who has ever lived has been non-liberal. The liberal, taking aim at every belief system that is undergirded by religion takes on every belief system in world history, large or small, whether it be the belief system of a great civilization like Christendom or of a small tribe. The belief systems are invariably grounded in some kind of religion. There are no exceptions. There are no exceptions in world history or over the entire surface of the world to this principle that religion has been the basis and grounding of their culture. But the liberal says, no, you're all wrong, I'm right. And it's a strange thing. It's a strange thing because of this, as I said before, these liberals will often maintain an attitude overtly of great sympathy and respect for other cultures. Islam is not a liberal culture. Neither is Taoism, neither is Confucianism even, neither is Buddhism, neither is Islam, well I said Islam, but neither is, in fact, any religion. No religion is liberal. Because every religion believes in what it believes. Every religion takes seriously what it believes and does not believe in the principle that there is no truth. Who is it that therefore does not believe in liberalism in the present day? Because it is a strange fact but true that many people living nowadays, the intellectuals, the educated people, will probably in their life, in their daily round, never meet anybody who's not a liberal. And will come to think that there hardly exists anybody that's not a liberal. Well, just to tell you, among some of the people that are the opponents of liberalism, there are of course the Christian philosophers, the philosophers that have not abandoned Christianity but still take Christianity as the basis of their philosophy, whether Catholic or non-Catholic, or more broadly religious philosophers, or the idealist philosophers, who base themselves not so much on Christianity or any of the well-known religions, but on perhaps the thought of the ancient Greeks, Plato and Aristotle. Or you've got the Eastern thinkers, who actually are more numerous than the West. The thinkers of India, of course the Islamic thinkers, the Islamic philosophers, the Sufi philosophers, the Hindu philosophers, the Buddhist philosophers, the Taoist philosophers, the Confucian philosophers. And then we can go back and look into remote periods of history for the dead religions and say, yes, they're all opponents of religion too. And let's not forget that. When people in their daily round, as I say, hardly come across anybody who's not liberal. Now, the destruction of Western civilization through liberalism, I believe that Nietzsche got it right. This occurs because of the weakening, the undermining, the eradication of the foundations of the moral system in the West, which had been provided by Christianity, largely by Christianity, in combination with the Greco-Roman elements, as I mentioned. The undermining of that is sufficient to bring the whole culture down in time, but it will not happen overnight. It's happening. In the meantime, however, as should be clear, the death of God is not one sudden event. The death of God is really the dying of God. It is the dying of these belief systems which has held up civilization in the past. And these belief systems continue to hold up, even to the present day, the civilization which exists now. The example that Nietzsche gives is the Christian doctrine of brotherly love or compassion, the Christian doctrine of egalitarianism, which has become a fundamental doctrine of the Western liberal world too. The difference being, as Nietzsche points out, the difference being that in the Western world now, in the liberal world, there is no reason for adopting the philosophical position of egalitarianism or the moral position of brotherly love or compassion. There's no reason for it, because the theology, the metaphysical basis or the theological basis of these beliefs have been undermined. Nevertheless, modern Western culture continues with them, but without being able to ground them, without being able to give a reason for it. Why consider all human beings equal? There was an answer during the era of Christianity. It's because every human being is made in the image of God. That was the answer. But since God has been rejected with the death of God, that answer is no longer available. Therefore, there is no basis anymore. This was Nietzsche's argument. And this applies just across the board. That all the meaning systems, all the belief systems which held up Christendom and which contributed to the unity of the Christian civilization, they have continued in weakened form but ungrounded form, staggered along in modern Western history, but they are under attack. And it is even the case that they are the prime objects of attack by modern intellectuals. That is to say, the leading intellectuals of the present day take Christianity as the prime target of their critique. And if not Christianity, Greek metaphysics, the idea of absolute truth, the idea of absolute morality, all the doctrines that held up at the most basic fundamental level the belief system of Christianity, those are the ones that are being attacked most fanatically and indefatigably by the intellectuals of the present day, to the extent that the content nowadays of university courses, not just in philosophy, but across the board in the humanities, are almost exclusively devoted to that one single topic. That is, the destruction and refutation and discrediting and disparagement of the belief systems which they take to be dogmatic, authoritarian, Christian, metaphysical, and so forth. These are the very belief systems, however, which still hold up Western civilization, even now, which always have and continue, even with a more feeble grip. So by attacking these very foundational beliefs, the West is being undermined, and this, above all, is the suicide of the West that Burnham talks about. In 1923, the famous physician philosopher Albert Schweitzer published a book called The Decline and Restoration of Civilization. And he said in it that everybody nowadays knows that Western civilization is committing suicide. Everybody knows this, said Schweitzer. The reason that this is happening is, according to Schweitzer, because there is no, he put it this way, there is no worldview, there is no philosophy to replace the philosophies that were the philosophies and religions and worldviews that were eradicated with the death of God. There is nothing there. Liberalism, in other words, also according to Albert Schweitzer, contributes to, or is indeed the main cause of the suicide of the West. Now, I haven't got much time except to wrap this up by referring to some of the tendencies of modern Western civilization and the people who believe in it and want to hold it up. In 1993, an American political scientist called Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History and the Last Man. It was not long after the fall of the Soviet Union. He said in that book that liberal democracy had won out the battle in the battle of ideologies, and that history was now settling in its final stage. In its final stage, we had got to the final stage of history in respect of ideological systems, belief systems. We've now arrived there. Not in practice, because the world hadn't all become liberal, but at least insofar as everybody realised that the liberal ideal was the only going ideal. And Fukuyama's model for this liberal belief system and this liberal civilization was the European Union. And the philosopher that Fukuyama leant on to the greatest extent in formulating his ideas was a Rousseau French philosopher, Alexander Kojève, who was an architect of the European Union shortly after the Second World War, and who formulated his ideal for a civilization in the phrase, a universal and homogeneous state. The ideal of civilization, of this new modern civilization, which would even be the final form of civilization, would be a state in which everybody is equal and everybody respects each other, and in which the material goods of society are distributed in an efficient way, such as to minimise social conflict and to maximise the satisfaction that the members of the society will have. This was the view of the utopia. This was Fukuyama's view and Kojève's view of utopia. And they're right that this is the de facto ideal of the European Union today. The European Union believes, the leaders of the European Union believe, that they are presiding over and administering a civilization. But they're wrong. They're presiding over, if anything, a declining and a civilization in decline and breaking up. Because the only values that they are able to recognise are, on the one hand, material values, economic values. The European Union is, above all, an economic organisation, and the values that for which it stands are, above all, economic, material values. But apart from that, it is supposedly liberalism, tolerance, supposedly. In other words, the freedom of anyone to do what they want to do. And as I said before, earlier, I don't think there's any content in that. And certainly not enough content to give people a civilizational consciousness, to give people a sense of identity as a member of a civilization. It is extraordinary that people think in the European Union or in this country, because we are really more or less an extension of the European Union. Extraordinary to think that we can, for example, absorb Muslim immigrants, Islamic immigrants, and that these people here, these Muslims who will come here, will be attracted to our civilization because we offer them tolerance. We offer them tolerance and we offer them material benefits. This is what we offer you. Come here and we offer you these things, material benefits and tolerance. And it's not surprising that a Muslim, or indeed anybody else who's serious about their religion, will say, that's not what I think life is about. Material benefits and tolerance, the ability to view pornography, or to go to a brothel, or to send money back home, or to make money, or to use a mobile phone, and to do what I like, that, just think what that would mean for somebody who was brought up in a traditional Islamic society. It would be obnoxious. And I'm not saying that's bad. It should be obnoxious. It should be. Because the ideals that are being offered are empty and materialistic. And this is what liberalism offers. And this is why liberalism represents the suicide and decline of the West. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.